Tamara, we are live.
All right, just let me know when I should start sharing.
I have made you a co-host. I'm not seeing anyone. Oh, there we go. We've got 3 minutes too, so I'm thinking should I go ahead and admit people or should I wait 2 more minutes?
Why don't you wait until we at least get Cindy in here?
Right.
And thank you for making me a co-host.
Right, always.
Yeah, definitely, Anna.
And I had paused the recording, but I'm going to go ahead and resume because we've only got about another minute.
Mm.
Welcome, everybody. I want to give folks a couple of minutes to get settled and make sure everyone gets into the meeting and that kind of thing. Okay. Okay, I think we'll get going. Welcome everybody to, gosh, it feels like it's been a while since we've met as a group. A lot's happened, of course, in a whole new year. I really appreciate, of course, everybody joining us here today. As we said, we tried a little bit of a different process for naming a date via one of the doodle polls, and picked a date that the most number of group members could come today. So I'm so happy to see all of you here. So Tamara, can you go to our next slide? Thank you. Okay. As Tamara's doing that, I want to remind everybody again that we are also broadcasting this meeting via YouTube to the public. And they don't have an ability to enter the chat or interrupt the meeting, that kind of thing, but they do have an ability to watch. We do always post these meetings up on our website too. So just so you know that, and kind of keep that in mind. Yeah, so our agenda today, we did focus it a little bit, I think, after we sent it to you the first time. And we focused it today on English learners. Both the weight and also discussing a bill from a few years ago called House Bill 3499. And I know some of you were highly involved in 3499. And today, as part of our presentation, we're going to have Mike Wiltfong returning, our state school fund director, but also we will have Mariana Prashnik Enriquez coming in to talk specifically about House Bill 3499. She's a team lead with our English learner group that works on that bill directly. So they're going to take us through, and when we saw how much information they had to share, we're like, oh, I don't think we have time for the other thing we had planned. So we want lots of time for questions and things. And then we'll go into small group discussions, after that, and do some report out, have a little bit of an update on the contract, and then talk about next steps. So that's our agenda for today. And I'm seeing a note that there may be people in the waiting room. So let me make sure that I have let in everybody that, yep, see them here. And that one I don't recognize. Look at that just a second while we do the technical stuff. We're trying to be very protective about who we let into this space. And so what that means is that if I don't recognize someone, we do not let them in. So let's see here. Let's see. I'll let them in. Hopefully. Okay. I think that's everything. I think I've cleared the waiting room. So for those of you who alerted me that there was someone in the waiting room. Okay, so Tamara, can you go to our next slide, please? Thanks. Okay. So one of the things that we like to start these meetings with is our old friend, the budget note. And I know we've gone through this budget note and a lot of details in some of the other meetings, but this is here as a reference. And just to remind everybody about, the focus of this group around the state school fund and spending, and determine, spending patterns, specifically with a focus on disparities between students who are Black, Indigenous, and people of color, and those who are not. So I just wanted to kind of refocus us on the budget note. So the next slide, please, Tamara. Okay. So these next two slides were our group agreements that we talked about in the first couple of meetings. So I wanted to just remind folks of what we decided were our group agreements, and these have been refined, based on those discussions in your small groups and in the larger group. So we talked about leaving positionality behind, but we talked about the limits of that for many of you who represent specific groups. And we have the clarification there under it about what that means. We talked about staying engaged, setting aside our emails and our phones and so forth. Speaking your truth and hearing the truth of others means, being open to thoughts and feelings, but speaking also from your perspective too. Expect and accept non-closure. And sometimes that happens when we're talking in a group like this. Also a commitment to building trust amongst ourselves and leading with integrity around our decisions. Next slide, please. There we go. We talked about we might experience some discomfort when we start talking about things like race and ethnicity and disability and gender and sexual orientation and privilege. But we have a shared commitment to bring these issues out into the open. We added, I think this was added from one of our small group discussions, around really specifically wanting to focus on BIPOC and tribal students, as the budget note talks about. We talked about like data requests going through our facilitators, to ODE staff, and not just coming from individual members. We're trying to start fresh, and try to leave a lot of our baggage behind. And then if a member misses a meeting, it's their responsibility to get caught up by reading materials and so forth. So those were our group agreements as a reminder to everybody. Thanks, Tamara. Can you forward to the next slide?
Cindy, I'm sorry to interrupt. Are you seeing, because I think there's a delay because I've been hitting it. And are you seeing the next slide now?
No, it's okay. I am. There's a little delay, but that's okay. We're doing okay.
Okay.
So with that, I'm going to turn it first over to Mike Wiltfong, and he's going to take you through the English learner weight and $34.99, and then his presentation will lead into Mariana's presentation. So Mike, take it away.
Thanks, Cindy. And good afternoon, everybody. Let me just apologize in advance. I have a little bit of a sore throat today, but I'm well enough to be here. So, but I apologize if my throat gets a little hoarse here. I'll power through. So let me just also center that, again, as Cindy identified, there's a number of us that are on this group that are familiar with House Bill 3499, that are very familiar with the state school fund, the weights, what have you. So, but again, just that not everybody has that same level of understanding. So in my presentation, I'm trying to, build the background of, what is the EL weight and the state school fund and the accounting aspect of that, as well as leading up to House Bill 3499 from my perspective. So with that, starting off with the first part, the statute that actually identifies the English learner weight in the state school fund. And that's the reference to the statute. And again, it's half a weight for each student in average daily membership. And again, just a refresher for terminology, average daily membership, or ADM, is the full-time equivalency of a student within a given school year. So for example, if you have a student that is there all year, they get 1 ADM. If you have a student that's there for only 3/4 of the year, then they would only get 0.75 ADM, and then adjusting. So oftentimes student counts or head counts, ADM will be a little bit less than student counts. So, but again, the statute calls for half a weight, students in average daily membership. And then again, for English language learner programs under ORS 336.079. ORS 336.079 speaks a lot to what makes up a program in the definitions. And so I won't go into too much detail about that, but essentially they have to have an English language program in order to qualify for this additional weighting. They just can't, just because they identify a student in need, they can't just identify that they need additional weighting for that. They actually have to have a program that they're enrolled in. And I'll kind of give a little bit of the history of that as we've gone through this. And again, I've been with the State School Fund. I started in 2006, so coming up on almost 16 years here in the not too distant future. But again, I've seen a lot of transition in that time with the English language learners, the weighting, and how that's. And again, I have a little bit of that history in this presentation. So let's start with the 2021, because that's probably the best data that we have so far. In that data collection, we have almost 58,000 students reported in the ADM collection for ELL. English language learners. And then I'm comparing that to 73,000, a little more than 73,000 that we reported in 2005-06. Oftentimes the reason that I'll use 05-06 as a reference is because that's when we, in Oregon, when we really changed to a more robust student data collection system that was at the student level. And prior to that, a lot of the data that was submitted to the department was reported in aggregate, and we didn't have a really good student level. But again, that's the first year that we had really good data. So that's oftentimes what I'll reference back to for comparison's sake if I'm looking for trends, what have you. So also of interest in 2021, 93% of students that are identified with EL weight were BIPOC compared to 78% in 05-06. So again, you can kind of see the demographics have changed somewhat during that time, a little over 15 years. So let's move on to the next slide. This next slide kind of breaks out what the different race ethnicities are within the EL weight. And so again, you can see that the vast majority of the students are Hispanic, identified Hispanic. And John Weens, as you remember, identified that sometimes where a student identifies Hispanic, even though that they may be identified as white or Black or Asian, would roll into the Hispanic category. And again, so the Hispanic number may be a little bit bigger than what it should be, but again, when I was looking through the data, it wasn't so much so that the remaining weights within the weighting were, I apologize, I have a cat that's trying to bug me right now, but more I'm going to this is that you can see that the remaining factors, roughly the remaining 23% of the weights are, again, with the 7% with white, 9% Asian, 3% are Black, and then the multiracial American Indian rounding out that. So again, the vast majority of the students are identified as Hispanic is what I'm trying to demonstrate there. All right, moving on to the next slide. So again, the funding and how that works is in 2021, there were a little over 50,000. Again, you can see where the ADM is a little smaller number than what we had for the actual number of students in 2021. And thus there was the 25,000 EL state school fund weights. So again, having the ADM number when we have the weight, then that maps out to about 25,000. And that 25,000 weights has been fairly consistent for a number of years, many years going back. In 2021, one weight in the state school fund equals almost $8,700 at this time. And I say at this time because we haven't fully reconciled 2021 just yet. We'll be doing that in May of 22. So again, almost $9,000 is the equivalent of one weight in the state school fund. So again, multiply that times the number of weights in the state school fund. You can see the math there in the third line, just almost $218 million is what's identified for English language learners. By comparison, going back to 05-06, again, you can see we have a little more than 26,000 weights. You multiply it times $5,200, you can see it's 138.9 million, almost $139 million. If you account for inflation over that time, and specifically for education inflation, actually that 5,200 number is actually a little bit more than what we are currently representing in the almost $8,700. So again, for comparison's sake, you can see that the share of the state school fund that's devoted to English language learners, as I'm trying to demonstrate there, has remained relatively constant when you account for inflation. And this next slide, if we can go to that, you can see where, again, this is from a previous presentation where I've showed the numbers of weights in the state school fund. And by and large, you can see where the first weight, or the general education weight, as we call it, represents about 82%. English language learner represents about 4% of the weights overall. Special education is 9%. The cap waiver for special education is 1%, and then rounding out for the rest. But again, by and large, the general education with roughly 4%. And so that translates to the amount of funding of the state school fund that's devoted to English language. So roughly about 4% is what that would map out to be overall. So I'm trying to illustrate there. If you go to the next slide, this is some more trend information that shows the numbers of weights in the state school fund going back to the early 90s. And so you can see again that from the early 90s, it continued to increase until we got to the early 2000s. And then in 05-06, again, that's when we first introduced a student information system. You can see it leveled off. And I don't believe that necessarily had anything to do with the reporting. It's just, I think it's just the timing of it is that that we had reached the number of English language learners, and we averaged roughly about 27,000 at that time. And you can see that we had that number for many years, and then we dropped off in the 2010-11. And that, what I believe, was due to, we started reviewing Title III data and the testing, ALPA testing data. And so we actually found where in some instances, some students were identified that shouldn't have been identified as English language learners. And then we found actually where there were instances where they hadn't identified students. And so it kind of went both ways. But again, you can see that the numbers kind of went down a little bit when we started incorporating other data sets to review the data that's in the state school fund. And it remained relatively level. And then it picked up a little bit. And I think that some of that transition is also due to not only the review of the data, but also the changes in definition for eligibility for students for ALPA testing, what have you. And so again, moving around a little bit with the data, but for the most part, fairly consistent, where again, just between 20,000 to 30,000, roughly about 25,000, as I mentioned, has been going for several years, almost 10 years now. So let's move on to the next next slide, please. As far as the percentage of students overall, we see a similar trend where the English language learners are, again, going up to where roughly about 10% of the students were English language learners in the early 2000s, and then dropped down to roughly in the mid 8% range, for a number of years again, through for roughly the last 10 years. So let's move on to the next slide. So the English language of the weight in the state school fund, and reviewing that, in 2008, I was asked to review the 2006-07 English language learner revenues and expenditures data in the state school fund. And I was asked to do that using the district financial data and what we call the chart of account codes. And we've talked about this previously, where we have this chart of account, we have a data collection that we review the financial audits of school districts each year. And then they use a standardized chart of accounts that's identified in what's called our program budget and accounting manual. And then I'll talk a little bit more about this, about the PBAM and the chart of accounts, because I think it's important to understand some of the accounting that goes into the financial reporting and how we go about that work. And at that time in 2008, there was interest to see data for each school district and for the state total as an average. And from what I knew, what I understood, that hadn't really been done before, that level of review. And again, we had better data. Our data systems were much more robust. Even our financial data collection had improved in the early 2000s, so that we could really start looking and drilling down on some of these expenditures. At the time, the total expenditures for English language learners was almost $125 million in revenue, and the totals were almost $150 million. So again, you can see roughly about a $25 million difference between what was reported as under expenditures and what was identified in revenues. And I can talk a little bit about that. On the revenue side, I simply just looked at the state school fund, what we distributed through the funding formula. And then on the expenditure side, I reviewed the financial data because we had some account codes that we could review that. So again, we could see that the expenditures were less than the state's total overall for revenues. And what we noticed is that those percentages of revenues and expenditures varied from district to district. Okay, can you explain the change terms of available data? Why is less? No, I apologize. The systems are more robust now than they were. So actually, and again, when I came in, not to change course here, but when I came on board in the mid 2000, we were improving our systems, and so the systems now are much more robust than they were. So again, my point is I was trying to explain that this type of work, this type of review hadn't really been done yet. And so again, we're kind of going down this new path of reviewing revenues and expenditures. So again, we found where there was a number of districts that were below the revenue, their expenditures were below the revenues. And then we found where there are districts where their expenditures were above. But again, there wasn't a 100% match. There was very, very seldom that was, really, really close. So I'm trying to get to. And this review went on for 7 years, and we'd reach out to districts to gain more understanding as identified there. So again, we were looking at the revenues, and what we would find is that the districts would comment, well, if we had known that this level of review or this accountability, if we had known that in advance, then yeah, we probably would have coded it differently. Or the how we're accounting for it, it's difficult to parse that out for the program that we have for English language learners. For example, if they had an immersion program, it was difficult to say, the expenses, how much is attributed to the EL side, the true EL, and then the non-EL students. And so again, those are some of the challenges that we heard earlier on. And this went on and it actually continues to today as far as the accounting for immersion programs, as an example. So let's go to the next slide. I'm going to talk a little bit about the PBAM, the chart of accounts, because again, I think this is kind of important to understand what the chart of accounts, what the PBAM, what that data collection, what its primary purpose is for, as far as accountability. So again, the PBAM was established in 1998, and the reason for it is we were trying to standardize reporting to promote consistent accounting across all school districts in the state. There was also a great need for federal reporting, was another aspect of this, where we wanted to, for comparison's sake, we want our federal partners with the Census Bureau, the National Center of Education Statistics, is also interested in our financial data, what we're spending on our title programs, what we're spending on special education, what we're spending on, elementary school, middle school, high school, what have you. There's all these different facets of how to account for the data. And to kind of show, and this is also a very robust collection. In our current chart, we have 7 different fund codes, and these fund codes are kind of the broad categories. And so the nomenclature for accounting, it goes fund, function, object, and then area responsibility, you can see there. But our 7 fund codes would be, for example, our general funds, our special revenues. General funds are the more discretionary funds. Special revenues are typically the state grant and aid that's earmarked specifically for a certain type of program. For example, special education or English language learners or poverty, for example. Those would be under your special revenues. And then we have, capital and debt service and enterprise funds. Again, we have 7 funds. And so that's kind of the larger buckets of money that we put money into. Is there a fund code specific for the state school fund? No, there is not a fund code. And again, we have roughly a little over 100 programs that are state and federal programs. The state school fund, granted, being one of the primary sources of funding, but where we track the state school fund is in the source codes. And so we do have a source code that is identified specifically for the state school fund. And we have other source codes that identify local revenues, such as county taxes, there's federal forest fees, there's federal resources, there's state resources, and essentially broad categories. There's 4 categories that are relatively broad, where it's local, state, intermediate, and federal. And again, we have 60 source codes that are identified right at this time. And then moving on to the expenditure side, we have 64 function codes. And I'll talk a little bit more about that and how this relates to the English language learners. But right now with the function codes, those are identifying, as identified a little bit earlier, is we can track expenditures for elementary schools, for middle schools, high schools, different types of different areas of interest. And sometimes these function codes are driven by federal needs, but sometimes they're driven by state needs. And I also will point out that the state funds or the function codes relatively mirror our federal chart of accounts. They're not too dissimilar, but Oregon goes a little bit beyond the federal codes to, again, try to address some of our more specialized interests. And then we have object codes. And the object codes are finer detail for the functions. So example, we can, in an elementary school, we can see how much was attributed to salary and benefits and PERS. And again, you can see that this data collection is fairly robust. The area of responsibility, we have 33 of those. And again, we look at, for special education, we have one for that. We have one for, we even have one for English language learners. We have one for, math. We have one for English, just English in general. So where I'm going with this is that in being able to analyze the data and slice and dice it, and again, this accounts for, this chart of accounts and the accounting codes as a whole, is capturing data in amounts of about $10 billion. So it's an extensive data collection that's used in a variety of ways. And so again, it's keeping that in mind that it's a very broad category, and the level of sophistication across the state in using these chart of accounts, admittedly it varies. We don't have the same accounting systems and softwares, and it ranges from with Portland Public all the way down to some of our small school districts still use QuickBooks and Excel for the accounting codes. And so again, the level of sophistication and the ability to in how they go about setting up their books, we leave that largely to school districts to decide how to do that work. We provide these in the PBAM, we provide guidance and recommendations on how to go about that. But what I can tell you is that not every school district does exactly the same across the state. So, all right, let's move on to the next slide. The chart of accounts, as I mentioned a little bit earlier, is used for state and federal reporting purposes. It's used in a variety of ways. It's used for analysis. We use it for the legislature asked us for information and reports, and we can derive a lot of information from that. And it should also be noted that the financial data collection that we have, we can drill down to, it's reported at the district level, but it's also reported at the school level, but it doesn't go beyond the school level. And that's kind of the challenge that we have with some comments that we've had is like, well, let's just change the chart of accounts so we can capture some of these program costs. Well, we don't have program IDs at the Department of Education, and I don't know if there's any interest to do that. But again, you can probably appreciate this, we have roughly about 197 school districts. We have a little more than 1,200 schools. And then at each school, there could be potentially a few different programs that, for whether it's special education or English language learners. And so the numbers of where we account and how we account for this data down to the program level, it could be extensive. But I just want to also keep that in mind that right now we don't account for finances at the program level. I can tell you that I went through a lot of work of several years ago where there was a federal mandate for school level expenditure reporting, and that was a substantial change in culture because for the most part, we report federally, a lot of other reports at the district level. But then again, pushing it out to the school level, that took, some districts are doing it, some districts are not doing it. But again, in order to meet this federal mandate that we're able to report, and I've talked about this in my previous presentations, the school level expenditure report, in order to do that, districts, we had to push that along for on a variety of reasons so that the data would be at the school level instead of at the district level. As I also mentioned in that, there's school level expenses and there's district level expenses, and not all expenses can be attributed to a school. So that's also our challenge. And then to move that forward to where you would say, well, these expenses are solely at the program level. Again, my point being is it can get very complicated very quickly trying to get down to the program level. Also, it should be noted that when we make changes to the chart of accounts, it takes a little time to implement that from the concept to utilization. And what I'm getting at there is that we have to allow time to meet and have conversations, discuss the needs, and then we have to appeal this because this is the state board reviews this. We have to authorize this. School districts also need time to set up their systems. The department needs time to set up its systems. It's how we go through the accounting. And so again, and having experienced this many years, it takes time for that from concept to utilization to actually come into place. There's also extensive training that we have to go into that. So again, it's not agile and nimble as some may think it may be. It's not, make it so, then a year later we're able to get data. It takes some time to change that. I also want to note that if we do make changes to the PBAM and the chart of accounts, that by simply introducing more data elements to try to account for this can create more ambiguity in the data. And again, the consistency of that data. So that we also have to guard against that. Too much code, people using the codes, understanding the codes, what it means, and making policy decisions on that, just as a forewarning that we have to be careful and guard against ambiguity by too many variables. And then again, also just identifying that we work with the chart of accounts, the staff of the Department of Education, members of my team. We work with an advisory group that consists of school business officials, auditors, and CPAs from around the state. And we usually have anywhere between 50 to 60 or so people around the state that participate in many of those conversations as far as making changes. And we were also part of the conversation with House Bill 3499. I'll touch on that here in just a second. So let's go on to the next slide. For the English language learner weight, we initially, I'll show you this chart that I developed back in the early 2000s to account for this. We essentially just had two codes that we were really looking at. Right now in the P-band, the chart accounts, we have a little bit more than that. And that was largely due to the work under House Bill 3499. And to that point, there was under House Bill 3499, there was great interest to add a lot of codes. We met with advocates, met with the Chart of Accounts Committee, and then actually we came to the decision to use these codes here moving forward. We felt that that was probably a nice, excuse me, a good place to be as far as the amount of accountability and meeting everyone's needs. And so that's, again, this is where we settled. Initially, we had Function 1291, and these are for the traditional EL programs. And then there was interest that we would go beyond Function 1291 to address the non-traditional programs, but typically are immersion programs. So we have the Function 1295. Excuse me. And then moving beyond that, we have Area Responsibility 280. So ideally, if you have an expense that's attributed to EL students that's not in 1291 and 1295, for example, if you want to roll that up under a middle school expense or a high school expense, you could report that under A of R 280 and it would be picked up. So when we do the analysis, and I'll show that here in just a little bit, we look at all these codes and we exclude and not include these different functions as needed. And then also, as part of 3499, we added what's called Appendix E, which is guidance and references for the EL and non-ELL related expenditures. And again, there was a lot of work that went into that with conversations with advocates and the concerns around how to report resources, whether that was translation services, whether that was immersion programs. Again, a lot of work went into that guidance. And there's also some resources there, references there as well. So let's move on to the next slide. So this was one of the earlier analysis that I have. I apologize, it didn't fit on the screen very well. And this is just basically the top portion. And you can see it was fairly straightforward, not near the report that we have nowadays for English language learner revenues and expenditures. But again, you can see where we just had the districts on the left-hand side, the expenses that were attributed, excuse me, to 1291, and then the expenses that were attributed to Area Responsibility 280, not including 1291, and then total all expenditures. And then we had the state school fund on the revenue side, and then the amount that's from the state school fund, the dollar amounts. And then again, you basically look at what the difference is between the revenues and the expenditures. You can see there for the first example, Baker, 93, a little over 93% revenues to expenditures ratio. A couple of districts below that, they didn't have any language learners. And yes, this was from 0607. Oregon. And then you can see Monroe dropped down to 63.6%. And then, like I said earlier, there are instances where there was a strong correlation where it was close to 100%. There was instances where districts actually spent more than they received in revenues. And then there was districts that spent less than the revenues. And where there was a substantial difference and there was a larger program, myself, Brian Reeder, who was a retired researcher at the department, would reach out to school districts to gain understanding what was going on. And then again, just bringing awareness to the field that there's actually people that are reviewing this data. I will also tell you, Kent Hunsaker from COSA was the one that initially asked me to do this analysis, to do this work. So I know also COSA was interested in this work. And so again, we would have a number of conversations as far as what was going on. And again, just kind of letting people know that we're watching, we're monitoring this. So let's go on to the next slide. And as identified, we did see improved correlations as we moved forward. The first year, admittedly so, it was a little rough. There was, clearly there was, but again, a number of districts would report, they said, well, I didn't realize that, we would be contacted about the reporting of this. I would have coded it differently had I known that. So with that knowledge, we moved forward and we saw improvements in the data. But again, there still was some concerns with spending and outcomes. And as a result, House Bill 3499 was implemented in 2015. There was a lot of review that went into that legislation. And as well as a more formal report was developed in response to that, much more robust than what, clearly what I was initially putting together. And that report is, I I don't know a number of pages, but it's a very interesting report if you haven't reviewed it. Also, House Bill 3499 provided additional reporting options for the guidance as identified in the PBAM. But again, as identified, there's still challenges in ability to analyze the reporting of financial data from the school districts without the House Bill 3499 staff reaching out to school districts for clarification and understanding. And I think a large part of that, and Mariana and I have talked about this, is that it will be hard to know what's really going on in a district just based on the data that you were getting from the financial audits, how that's rolled up. In order to have those, those conversations, what's really going on. I think that, the current structure we have right now will certainly highlight some issues that we have, and we'll get you, roughly 80% of there. But again, as Maria and I have talked to that, we believe that perhaps there's something else that we can do outside the chart of accounts, outside the PBAN guidance, outside the overall financial collection for the state, that to get at and try to capture this information as far as the spending and where there's a review of the outcomes for the school district as well as the spending and the revenues, and then doing that work. And so with that, Mariana is going to take it from here, and she's going to share her perspective of 3499 and then moving forward. Thank you.
Thank you, Mike, and good afternoon to the entire advisory group here. I'm very excited to be here. Mike, I did want to just bring attention to a couple questions in the chat before I take over and move through. The first question is there a specific fund for the state school fund, a fund code, or is it broken up?
No, there's not a fund for the state school fund. They're typically school districts report that under their general fund because it's a discretionary source of funding. And then, however, there is a source code that we use to capture how much revenue a school district receives from the state school fund.
And then the other question on slide 17, when we were showing the example of the analysis, was that data from, what year was that data from?
That was from 2006-07. That was a very early version of the analysis that we started. And again, where we have morphed into what we have a much more robust report that we have today.
Awesome, thank you. Well, I will go ahead and it would help if I wasn't on mute. I will go ahead and take it away now. I am so excited to be here today. My name is Mariana Prashnik Enriquez. I am one of the members of the House Bill 3499 team. And in House Bill 3499, we spent a lot of time working with districts to explain what we mean by EL ADM weighted funding and what the difference is between the weighted funding and EL expenditures. And so just a quick review, like Mike described, the weighted ADM is a combination of the EL ADM, the weights for that year, and then the rate for that year. And what we can see at the state level is how districts code. In the House Bill 3499, we provide grant programs to districts, and these grants are provided on a reimbursement basis. And so districts tell us, they receive an allocation amount, they tell us how they're going to spend that money, and then they spend the money and we reimburse them for what they've spent. With EL weighted ADM, it's very districts don't provide information on how they plan on spending that money. They receive the monies and then they go ahead and code the expenditures for those dollars on the back end. And so what this looks like on our end when we're able to pull these reports, if we can go to the next slide, is something like this. And so this is an example from one of the 3 districts that we did EL expenditure direction with. And we can look at everything that they coded to those codes. So area of responsibility 280, function 1291, and we can break it up into all of the different expenditure categories. And so this is an example of a district that spent 100% of their EL weighted ADM dollars, and you can see the breakup of how those dollars were spent. One thing that we quickly noticed when we started to do these analyses is that a large majority of these dollars are being spent on personnel, on people, on FTE, on human capacity. And so this is an example of one of the districts. You can see that a big chunk of it, we're talking about, over 57% is spent on licensed salaries. And then we have administrator and classified salaries coming in at about little under 5%. And then all of the expenses that go with having people on staff, like Social Security, like different payroll costs, those are all included. Those are not included. Those are additional to those dollars. If we can go to the next slide, please. So House Bill 3499 is a program that many of you all are familiar with, but I'm going to give a little bit of an overview just to make sure we're all on the same page. We provide funding and technical assistance to districts. And we have two classifications of districts. We have target districts, which are districts that have shown a high need and, a low need and a low outcome. So districts that are not performing to the expectation in elementary or secondary. Then we have transformation districts, which are districts that are showing systemic needs across the board in both elementary and secondary. We also have another phase of our program where we have 6 EL specialists located at the ESD level that provide supports to districts that have a smaller N size. Originally they provided support to districts that have a N size of less than 20 English learners. Now they are released to provide supports to all Oregon districts. One of the reasons that we wanted to make sure we had that level of support is because when we ran our data to identify districts that had less than 20 ELs were not captured within that pool. And so we wanted to make sure we were providing supports to those districts as well. We engage in a comprehensive needs assessment process that looks at the current EL programs and practices, the current transformation efforts, the data that they're showing, and the EL weighted ADM dollars that are being spent and how they're being spent. And then we go ahead and engage in some improvement planning and monitoring using state data, but also using local data, especially in this new reality, the last couple of years where a lot of our data collections have had major impacts because of COVID. We recognize the need to also ground in local data as well. We provide fiscal supports in funding. We give funding to all of our districts in order to implement systemic interventions. And currently for cohort 2, this allocation is determined using a weighted funding formula. This is in addition to the EL weighted ADM dollars that these districts receive, in addition to the Title III dollars that districts receive, in addition to the SSA dollars that districts receive. And these districts, like I mentioned previously, are identified using elementary and secondary rating indicators. Each of these ratings are a combination of 7 indicators, and all of these indicators come from our previous data collections. Our House Bill 3499 data profile looks very similar in data points to the Oregon State Report Card. The only difference is that we're paying extra close attention at how English learners are performing with these indicators and the comparison of the English learner group to the all student group. We can go to the next slide. This is an example of our lessons learned applied to providing funding to districts. In cohort 1, which was year 2015 through 2021, districts that were in the transformation category received $180,000 per year for 4 years. Districts that were in the target category received $90,000 per year for 4 years. In cohort 1, we had 40 districts that were identified, 15 of which were transformation, 25 of which were target. In cohort 2, we wanted to provide more systemic targeted supports. And so we went ahead and identified 15 districts and provided a floor, a minimum of $125,000 per year, and then a maximum of $1.5 million per year. And the weights that were calculated into their funding formula are displayed on the screen. We have 2 transformation districts and 13 target districts in cohort 2.
Mariana, there's a couple of questions and comments that came in the chat. I want to be sure that we captured those and that if they wanted, anyway, and you had a chance to answer them too. So the first one that came in was from Morgan Allen. It says, and I think it was a couple of slides back, it said the average school district in Oregon spends 85% plus of their state school fund on salaries and benefits. Some districts are approaching 90%. And then he also said, I believe the state budget staff, so at DAS, uses 86 or 87% when they calculate the state school fund current service level. And Morgan, I didn't know if you wanted to add anything else to that, or okay. And then the next comment is a question. Okay. So this is from Carlos Sequeira, and it says, do you also provide the districts a way to of examining and applying culturally appropriate best practices per the bill's intent when the EL are not performing as well as their peers?
Yes, absolutely. This is part of our comprehensive needs assessment process. We look at what is currently in place in these districts, and we work with districts to identify. We have something called allowable expenditure guidance. It's based off of the Castaneda standards. And we really look at not just are the practices in place culturally appropriate, but what does implementation of the systemic interventions that are going to be implemented look like? Is there adequate resources? Is there adequate attention being put into monitoring not just the progress of the results of what's being implemented, but also the implementation. So we're looking a lot at making sure that it's a systems approach involving various aspects of the school district. We want administrators to be really, really locked into how these, so it's not just about doing, let's say, constructing meaning protocol. It's about how is that constructing meaning protocol being implemented across the district, and where are the administrators of is the information in the walkthroughs? How are EL communities engaged, parents and families, in understanding what is being implemented and how it's being implemented?
And I see we have another question, Mariana. Do the personnel have to be connected to the EL coded expenditures? That question is from Amanda.
Yes, that's a really great question. And this goes back to what Mike was saying, and how districts implement these codes in a variety of ways, depending on, what and I don't know if the answer is more codes or better guidance, but districts have, so I'll give you an example. You might have a district that has equity director, and that equity director might be working with many culturally specific student groups, and that involves English learners, that involves Latino, Latinx students, Black students, Indigenous students, and that if that funding is coming directly, being coded directly to EL expenditures, then that would perhaps be an example of the personnel being connected to EL coded expenditures, but not, being fully dedicated to supporting EL programs, practices, and students. So it's implemented in a variety of ways depending on the district.
I think that adds that last comment probably gets to it. Does everybody provide that level of detail in a description? So for example, would you know that the personnel for each of the districts, it would be like an equity personnel, for example, versus just personnel? Or do they have to just rely on guidance? So I'm just trying to understand what the level of detail is.
Yeah, that's a great question. If you can go back, Tamara, like 1 or 2 slides to the slide 20. So this is the level of information that we can pull at the state. And so from what a district is coding to their EL expenditures, we can just see that they have, in this example, 2.6 of their EL expenditures going towards an administrator. We, at this level, don't know what administrators, what position description. This is the level of information. Now, in House Bill 3499, once we get into the directed funding stage, we dig much deeper. So we go to a district and we say, out of this 2.06%, what exact positions is this funding? What buildings are these positions in? What are the duties of these positions? And that's when we can get to that level of information, but it requires that additional conversation.
And there's no requirement. So that just depends on whether you all are doing a review of that or not.
Correct.
Okay, thank you.
And Mariana, there's one more question from Carlos. Is there a connection of this team with the teaching and learning department? And I suspect what he means by this team is probably the Equity, Diversity, and Inclusion Office, and specifically your team, the EL team, the 3499, and the teaching and learning department. So, and I can let Carlos expand upon that if he'd like to.
Yeah, just real quick, I think that, it's evident that there's a large amount of funding that is dedicated to staffing, right? I think Morgan said close to 90%. And it seems that sometimes in the schools, the teachers that are working with the students are working in isolation, siloed from and I'm using air quotes here, for regular education classroom. And so my question is there any modeling happening in the ODE where this work is happening jointly? The work that is the support that is given to the students and the schools systemically, is it the model where there is a collaboration with the teaching and learning team as well? So that there is some kind of accountability that the practice is actually best practice implemented, not just at the state level, Mariana, like you coming in and training the teachers, but actually helping the rest of the schools with the students attend.
Yes, that's a great question. And my answer is yes, and yes, there are absolutely connections. Yes, there is a deep intent to make sure that we're connecting all of our systems, and there's always room to improve and to grow and to learn. And so one example of the way that we've tried to connect in our cohort 2 better than we did in cohort 1 is we grounded our comprehensive needs assessment process on the same MTSS framework that's used in the district school improvement spaces and in the SSA spaces. And this is the ORIS framework. And so we looked at, and we also tried to make sure that districts, when they're considering what systemic interventions are we going to put in place, that first they consider what systemic interventions are we already putting in place, and how are we already addressing the indicators that we're prioritizing, and what programs, what touch points at ODE are already working on these, so that we can, instead of creating, like you said, this other siloed approach, this other siloed systemic intervention system, so that we can try to weave them together and map them together. And so we, in the example of our 3 districts that are in directed funding currently, and even some of our districts in cohort 2, there's something called intensive coaching that some districts receive. It's an opt-in approach that they can receive from the district school effectiveness kind of teaching and learning department. And so we try to link in really deeply with those and make sure that we're touching bases and that we're, speaking the same tune, marching to the same beat, so that districts aren't, not just so that it makes sense to them, but also so that they're not asked to provide the same information a whole bunch of times. So we can try to share the information and share the plans and the implementation and the systemic interventions.
You got a thumbs up there, Mariana. So I think that's all the questions. You can move forward with your presentation.
Awesome. I'm almost done here. This is the last slide. We talked a little bit about how we have two current cohorts. Our first cohort received 4 years of intervention and funding. Our second cohort is currently in year 1. So completing their comprehensive needs assessment, submitting their action plans for the next 4 years, and receiving their funding in order to implement those action plans. With our cohort 1 districts, those original 40, after 4 years, we implemented our OAR. So the OAR is hyperlinked here, 581-020-0621, which was the OAR that gives ODE the responsibility of assessing and evaluating the progress that districts have made in the 4 years that they have been part of the program. And the districts that have not made sufficient progress, those districts were put into this other phase of the program, which is called directed funding. And so this is the phase that is really relevant to this conversation, where we're looking at their EL weighted ADM dollars that they received. And we looked at the 2019-20 year to start this process. And then we looked at how that funding was expended, what percentage of that funding was used towards EL expenditures. So we ended up with 3 districts out of our 40 that went into this phase. And of these 3 districts, we had a wide array. We had one district that spent about 60% of what they received on EL expenditures. And we had another district that spent 160% of what they received on EL expenditures. But again, I want to caution us when we think of those percentages to also take into account that the way that districts code are very different. And so the district that coded, for example, 160%, the way that those codes were implemented may or may not mean that 160% of those dollars went to EL students, whereas the district that went 60%. And so it's very unique to the district. And so knowing that, we went in and we pulled all of their data and we had a conversation around these licensed salaries, these instructional materials, this percentage of what you spent, what exactly was that spent on? And so you have an example here of the ORS that guides that responsibility that we have to implement, and the OAR. And we use the 2020 directed funding guidelines, and again, the EL ADM weighted EL expenditures to make this analysis. We engaged in a very delineated process that included not just the administrators and the educators at the district level to create a collaborative conversation to better understand how these dollars are used, and then to create a direction for how they will be used for the next 3 years. We also engaged EL community in this conversation. The EL community a lot of times had the liaisons that were hired. Many districts spent the dollars on putting family community liaisons in place, putting instructional assistants and other culturally specific service personnel in place. And we banked on their perspectives and also on parents and families to better understand how these dollars are used and what would make the most sense for using them moving forward. But again, a large part of these funds are spent on people, on FTE. And so this is something that we had to take into deep consideration when creating our expenditure directions. So that's pretty much the end. I see there's one more question here in the chat. Is there a reason we wouldn't have consistent coding across districts? So the coding is consistent. The way the coding is used is not consistent. So an example, again, would be that I might be coding I'm going to just give an example. I might be coding, I might have 3 third grade teachers in my elementary, and one of those third grade teachers serves a large majority of my EL students. And so I might code some of that FTE towards my EL expenditures. I might have, 4 instructional assistants, and one of those instructional assistants is working primarily within the EL program. And so coding it towards that. So it's different the way that districts use the coding. It's not that the coding is different. It's the way it's implemented.
I'll add to that. Oftentimes where we see where they are expending considerably more than what they receive in revenues, it's typically those are associated with immersion programs. And what the guidance in the program budget accounting manual is that districts are to prorate those programs for the students that are English language learners and then that are non-EL students. However, we still see, even though with the guidance, with the, what have you, the chart of accounts, understanding new staff, turnover, what have you, we still see the inconsistencies in the data. And so it's an ongoing challenge of making sure that people are understanding how to go about that work. And so again, just like any industry, we're seeing a lot of turnover, not to make excuses, but we are seeing turnover in staffing, what have you, and understanding with that. And again, because we don't have a uniform accounting system across state, that's another challenge that we have, is that learning, understanding the complexity, it's not a perfect system as much as we would like it to be a perfect system.
Exactly. And in the directed funding process, we asked districts after we gave the expenditure direction to provide projections. So once the funding comes in, they know how much they're going to receive for the year. Districts will receive that dollar amount. And then the next time that we hear about this is when they code their expenditures. So this is how much money you got. And then they tell us, okay, this is how we spent it. For the districts and directed funding, we asked them to also provide us projections. We said, this is the amount you're getting for the 21-22 school year. How do you anticipate spending it before they go ahead and turn in their expenditures later on? And the way that came in from these districts was very different from all three. It didn't look exactly the same because of the different ways that districts go about their unique accounting. And so you might have a district that has a dual immersion program or a bilingual education program that serves like a 50-50 split, 50% English learners and 50% native English speakers. And that entire program may or may not be coded towards the EL expenditures, which is, if it is all coded towards EL expenditures, is not the appropriate use of the coding.
Hey, are there additional questions for Mariana or Mike? It's kind of a lot of information. We thought it was important to put this in front of you. Well, several of you had asked for more in-depth, presentation on EL. EL is obviously one of the biggest weights that comes out of, or rather is used to calculate the state school fund. It's also the weight that's had a lot of review and attention in recent years. So we thought there were some lessons to be learned here, right? So are there additional questions before I break you out into smaller groups? Okay, so I'm going to break you out into your usual smaller groups. And these are our prompts that we're going to have. You're going to have your usual facilitators with the exception of one group. You get a special treat today. So our administrator group that usually is facilitated by Ben Bowman, Ben had to be pulled away to another matter. So you have Mariana facilitating you today, and she's going to be joined by Josh Rue in the group as well, who's one of our crack researchers in this area. So you get a special treat. Otherwise, the rest of you get, same old, same old. So I'm going to pull you out into your small groups now, and then we'll pull you back together in a bit, and we can do a report out of all the groups. So, okay. This would also be a good time for a break if you want to take a little break. I'm getting this set up. Okay, I think I got it.
Are we doing our break before we do our report out, or are we doing report out and then break?
Oh, Natalie, do you know? Because Cindy just gave everyone a 2-minute warning. So I'd say you have 2 minutes at least, but are we doing the break?
I'll take my break now.
Here you go. I'll let you know. I'll catch up.
I just said, but I was muted, wasn't I? I'm sorry. The agenda says that there's a 5-minute break, and then after that, it'll be the small group report out.
When do you think everyone will need to be back then? Do you think in 5 minutes or like 7 minutes?
Well, they've still got about a minute of their 2-minute warning, so 6 minutes.
6 minutes. Okay, everyone that can hear my voice, you have a 6-minute break.
Well, welcome back, everybody. Let's see here. I'm not sure that we're all back. I think I pulled everyone back, but I'm not sure that I send a little message, I think. Oh, I see. People are just wrapping up. Okay. Now I think we're all back. Okay. Okay. So now that we're all back, I wanted to give us a chance to report out about some of our conversations in our breakout rooms. And yeah, thanks, Natalie. And give each other a chance to kind of hear some of the conversations. And then also we took notes on the breakout rooms. So as always, we'll feed those back into the larger conversation. So just know that. So if something isn't mentioned today, we have it in notes as well. So yeah. So do I have a volunteer from one of the breakout rooms to report out about your conversation? Otherwise, I'll just start calling on folks. Okay, Tamara and Mike. Breakout room number 4. Oh, I see that Natalie told me that the first one's back started a 5-minute break. So maybe folks are in a break.
Yeah, Tamara was going to report out. She was taking notes in our group, but I think that we're on a break because we understood that we're to take a break before we.
I'm sorry. You know what? Let me give folks maybe an additional 3 minutes and we'll reconvene at like 5:40 so that everyone can be back. Sorry for the misunderstanding. So, okay, we'll come back in like 2 minutes now. Okay. Now we'll try this again and pull everybody back together. Sorry about that. Let's see if I could see our group. Thank you. Thanks, Natalie. If I could see our group facilitators, if let's say I see Carmen and Mike, Mariana, Tamara, are you back yet? There she is. Yay. Okay, so now we have a few minutes left. So I thought we'd go around and do a bit of a report out from the small group discussions. So I'm going to start with group 4, who had Tamara and Mike Wiltfong facilitating them. And so the first question we had, and you can blend these two together anything you'd like, any themes or anything that came out of your group, Tamara. So what observations do you have regarding the EL weight for the data collections from 3499 that could apply to the goals of the committee? And what lingering questions are there? Yeah.
Well, great. The group that I was helping facilitate had some questions about kind of just the history. So like, what are the percentage of overall students are EL students? And Mike answered 8%. And then just in the general student population, we talked about how 40% are identified as BIPOC, which equates to around 220,000 students. Ask the question, how did we arrive at the particular weight? And then just a general question, for example, like where is funding for a typical Black student if they're not in another weighted group? And then Mike talked about how the state school fund has 9 weights. 3 are student level weights and the remaining 6 are district level weights. And we don't have a specific weight for Black students or any racial student group. They are just calculated in the general education weight. And just as a reminder, 82% of the state school fund goes through the general student weight. And so it's largely an enrollment fund formula system. And then each year, I believe it's around $218 million is part of the EL weight, which then gets shifted according to the student populations of each district. And the purpose of that additional funding is to provide additional resources to support the needs. And then there was some questions around how has there been success from the EL program? And we thought Mariana might be able to respond to that. And what is happening with the 3 schools out of the 40 that needed a plan of assistance? And then is there a district that has a high percentage of EL students and is doing really well with those students? And are we sharing those best practices with the school districts that are not performing as well? And they understood that this was an example of using dedicated funding to help target support for a group of students, and wondering how this work connects with HB 2016, which created the African American Black Student Success Plan. Is there a similar charge and similar funding structures? And then asked generally, can you use race as a funding category? Do other states use race as a weight in their formula? And then a bit of a discussion of state rights and the constitutional protection of protected classes.
Thanks, Tamara. I did see one of the initial questions is how did we arrive at the weight? It's existed since at least the early 90s, and it's always been 0.5 since that time, and has not been revised upward or downward, right? As is the case for most of our weights, right? But I don't know how they arrived at 0.5 versus something else, you know? Good questions. Okay, I'm going to move up to group number 3, and group number 3 was facilitated by Carmen. Yeah, what was your discussion, Carmen?
So I'm going to go fairly quickly, and Amanda and I, we're both going to share. So one of the key questions was specifically that in this group, there was some folks that had historical knowledge about House Bill 3499. And one of the observations that was made is that House Bill 3499 was not designed to be punitive, but it was designed and said, we're identifying you as having, as needing to, serve, our emergent bilingual students. And we're going to work with you for 4 years. And if you don't, then we're going to direct your funding. And even if the direction of the funding is not punitive, so the direct quote was direct funding. The goal is not to take away the funding. The goal is to give you the opportunity to meet the needs of students. And keeping that student-centered focus, was a highlight of the conversation. The other critical part that I would say is that we need to have definitions, and words are very important. Consistency. Again, how we define economically disadvantaged, and how we define poverty, and that if we're going to align them, they should be aligned all through the agency and not utilize maybe different definitions. So there's clarity and transparency and intentionality around the words that we use. Also, that we needed to understand some of the lessons of House Bill 3499, which is that, we have the codes, so it's their inconsistency in the districts, how these codes are being applied. And then what are the practitioners that live in the districts versus the technical accounting of it, and how this defined, and what kind of guidance is and what's the guidance and expectations, and how do we unite those two? How do we unite this to what's the possible solution, because we have the codes. Do we provide clear guidance? If there's clear guidance, do we also provide some expectations with that? And then with the SSF, understanding that what are the limitations and what do districts understand so they can meet the needs of BIPOC, tribal and indigenous students. And we need kind of a baseline structure of how districts spend their funding. And do we utilize the codes for that information, or what are the conditions that we need to create in order for us to be able to get that information? Amanda?
Yeah, no, that was a really great summary. I mean, at a high level, was just really appreciative of the presentation because, again, being outside of the system, it's helpful to understand that we have these consistent codes. I do think that's an incredible and an important starting point. It does sound like a huge challenge is that all of these districts are using different accounting systems. So again, those are technical issues that can come up, but I think ultimately coming back to the charge of this group and what we're looking at, there are important lessons in that, it's very concerning that districts would get funding weighted for EL students and that there wouldn't be a relationship to an EL expenditure. Like that shouldn't happen. And I think there are spaces to learn about why that isn't happening. Again, those could be technical, those could be other reasons. And I think with what we're doing here is if we can get more information and transparency by looking at these codes and making sure that whoever is hired to do this study is actually focused on untangling how that translates for the state school fund. Because again, I'm hearing that we have these fund source codes and this great rigor around how we analyze these grant programs. And when it comes to the state school fund, we have a revenue source code and that's great, but for some reason we don't apply the same rigor. And to me, it's just a matter of transparency. Like we have to understand what we're doing in order to understand where we need to go. And it feels like if we can get to a place where we can have just even a baseline understanding of what we're doing and really lean on the fact that we do have these consistent codes would be really helpful.
Thanks, Amanda. That's helpful. Okay. And then Mariana, group 2.
Can I tee off, Mariana, real quick something? There was a lot of really rich conversation and a lot of things that were said that were over my head. But this is my takeaway from what George was sharing around the formula and the weighting and some ideas of how it works in reality. My takeaway is that if I'm an ELS, the way that the formula is set fixed right now and the way that the weights are created, if I'm an EL student in Northeast Portland and I'm an EL student in Eastern Oregon, I will receive better services, potentially the way that things are created in East Portland than I would in Eastern Oregon. And so there is an equity in the way that the resources, so I'm going to leave it at that. Maybe invite George to elaborate a little bit more on that, why I came to that conclusion. And then the other piece was that the accountability piece on does the money follow the student and to what degree and what is the level of not transparency, but the structures in place to ensure that that funding is really being utilized to impact that student. So I'm going to pass it on to Mariana and George. Maybe you can help me out.
I'll share some stuff. And thank you, Carlos. And I'm sorry if I muddied the water in any way for anybody. I was just sharing that the reality is when you have a 0.5 for an ELL, very pleased, very thankful, love the funding. And the reality is I'm just going to call it, I was a first generation newcomer student that came to the United States, and I needed more time, more practice, more opportunities to grow my English, to read, to write, to speak, to communicate. So a 0.5 weighting is beautiful, and it's necessary for children to get on level, to graduate, and to move forward. So it's great. And I love our weighted formula. Love the 0.5 ELL. Love that we have a 2.0 for SPED. Love that we have 0.25 for poverty. Love that we have rural school weightings. All those kinds of things I think are necessary for school districts. So I was sharing those kinds of concepts, but the reality is sometimes when you have, like in a certain area, let's say a rural area like LeGrand, and I might have 40 or 50 students that are ELL students, I might only have one teacher or a teacher and a parapro to serve all those 40 or 50 students based on my economy of scale. And it won't be the same as having two teachers, or it won't be the same as having two teachers and two parapros in a building being able to support children, because our machines are different machines. Some machines are really nice engines and they have all kinds of staffing and they have all kinds of people that apply for jobs. And some machines really don't have a lot of people that apply for jobs, or really even have people that are ready to do that kind of work long term. And so there's inequities just in being able to say, yes, I serve them the same, because if you don't have the finite, or I'll just say the resources or the people to do all the work, that's where you have to do other things, whether it's conferencing or working with ESDs and having ESDs do things for you. And you have to do all these other itinerant things to make something work, but it's still not as great as a place that has a lot of staff or a lot of folks that are applying for the work or can do the work or are qualified to do the work. So my example was some of the, there's going to be system inequities sometimes based on where you live. And that's part of the thing. And to just further that along, it's just that, I know we talked a little bit more. I'll just say this. We talked more about best practices for newcomer students, best practices for level 1, level 2, level 3, how much you should do for primary grade levels, how much small group, how much one-on-one, how much support can you give so that a student can become proficient faster, maybe at 4th grade, maybe at 5th grade within a 5-year period. What can you do in middle school and high school to keep proficiency? What kind of program should you have in place? Having indicators like that is great. And if you can do those kinds of things to monitor students and help them to move forward and to graduate, that would be great. But just know that some locations can do that very easily. And for some, it's a lot of work to make sure that happens. So it's not always equitable. And I want to just sharing a little bit more about what it's like in rural areas. In rural areas, sometimes you have difficult finding teachers that want to relocate just to work where you're at. Their families don't live here. They don't have a lot of friends or relationships here. They're letting go of some of their networks to get to that place. And then after 2 or 3 years, they want to go back to where they know people or where they love people or where they have these relationships. So those are issues that take place in these areas. And if you want to do different things, I want to really getting into I'll just call it the winners and the losers conversation that Michael said, basically in our first meeting. You have areas where, depending on where you live, you're getting bottom third funding, and you're going to always get bottom third funding depending on where you live. And when you are there, guess what you do? You pay bottom third. You can't pay top third. When you don't get top third money, you pay bottom third. You pay bottom third benefits, you pay bottom third funding, and you stretch people out more than ever for them to do everything that they can for children so that they can graduate, so that they can be successful, so that they can have a high quality experience. So there's stuff in all of this that has inequities no matter what, depending on where you live. And just people understanding the totality of all that's very important. And those are some of the things that I shared in our conversation.
Thanks. Sounds like a very rich conversation going on there. Is there anything else from that group, Mariana, or anyone else, group 2?
That was a really great summary. The only thing that I would add is John also shared, how the presentation that was shared didn't really help us get closer to the key questions. It just provided more insight into how the challenges and the difficulties that we're experiencing and being able to track the dollars that are provided back to the services and the resources and the time that EL students are receiving. And one thing that I am going to put in the chat that I also feel is relevant and connected to this conversation as part of the House Bill 3499 program. One of the efforts we're engaging in is developing an EL resource bank of best and promising practices for the field. And so I'm going to put just like a little quick synopsis of that in the chat box as well.
Thanks, Mariana. Okay, so that brings us to group one, which was my group. My group has folks in it that have been around $34.99 in the EL weight for a while, but they did make some observations around some of Mike's presentation. They didn't realize that even with that background, that the EL weight only resulted in like 4% of the money from the state school fund. That Mike's, one of his first slides was very eye-opening to them. And, talking about like as a percentage of the whole, it's just not that much, so that was an observation. They also had wonderings around if the data varies from district to district that much, with people putting things in different categories and that kind of thing, how will the researcher for the group be able to draw conclusions or do their work if the data itself is variable from district to district kind of thing? And they also made an observation that as districts are trying to code expenditures and things in PBAM, that they spend a lot of time trying to find the right code, consulting with each other, are you putting this expenditure in this, that kind of thing. So there's a lot of effort that, districts are trying to be very mindful of doing that. There was some wonderings, I think centered kind of around the 3499 work, Mariana, about how districts are selected for transformation and target. And I know we have information on that. And how are they selected for directed spending? And then they're kind of wondering back to the initial sort of assumption that created the group is money being inequitably spent on students who are not BIPOC? So that was an overall wondering that this group had. So, yeah, so I think that concludes our groups. And then what we will do is, of course, the facilitators will get together and kind of compare notes. And like I said, we took notes. We'll probably send out some additional information to this group based on some of those questions that were raised. Happy to send out more information about transformation and target districts and, some of the other questions that were raised. As far as next steps, for our next meeting, we will dive more deeply into the teacher experience factor. That was a question that a lot of you had. And then also teachers of color. I know that there was some wonderings about, if we were to shift the factor or add a new factor, that kind of thing. So we're spending a bit of time on that. And really diving a bit deeper into what is the teacher experience factor in the state school fund. So that's one of the, the items for the next meeting. So for those of you who saw that in the initial agenda, don't worry, you will see that eventually. And I see a suggestion from George, rural school funding would be a great topic. I assume probably disparities between rural school funding and urban school funding, I'm guessing, based on your group discussion today. So, and then
I would say, just in case, I would say rural, urban, suburban, and even rural versus rural. There's different inequities in that too.
There are for sure.
Before we say yes, we're adding that to the agenda. George, can you give some more clarification? I think I know the answer, but I want you to say what you're leading to that helps us to answer the question about the disparities of BIPOC students. Are you saying that there's the same percentage of BIPOC students in the rural areas as the urban areas, and what's the difference is the economy of scale?
Definitely that is part of it. The economy of scale and the ability to provide more services when you don't have enough money or enough funding to do all the services. That's part of it, I would say. And another part is just, again, it's more on over time, just whether it's BIPOC or not, when you experience a lack of funding because whether you have enough ELL students or whether you have enough poverty students or whether you have enough anything, if you're receiving a bottom tier funding, you're stuck in that spot. So when you're stuck in that spot, you're not going to have the same level of programs or services. You're not going to have the same level of opportunities for all children because you're just not getting that same level of funding. And that over time creates a pay equity too. It creates a, I'll just say less services.
I understand those pieces. I guess I would want, along with what you're seeing then, I would want to know the population of BIPOC students in rural areas versus the suburban, urban, whatever, to be able to say that BIPOC students in the rural area are commensurate in number to the BIPOC students in the urban or suburban areas. And then we could go with that assumption of economy of scale.
And I would probably say, I think my concern definitely is that, but it's probably more on just the general all. So I know that it's not BIPOC only for what I'm trying to describe. It's all students wind up having a little bit less. And
I totally get that. I'm trying to stay focused.
Yeah, and I'm also fine too. I don't want you to think that I'm trying to derail anything. For me, I love our funding formula. I think it's very equitable. I think it's done in a way that a lot of students that have needs get their needs met. And so I wouldn't say that I don't approve of what we do. I would just say that there are inequities that take place due to, I'll just say, not having enough resources long-term. So I'll just stop.
And I think somebody mentioned earlier, one of the questions that someone brought up was the Lane African American Black Student Success Program, which we have at Lane ESD. And that's one thing that we identified. We serve 14 of our 16 districts are rural schools. And one of the things that was an inequity for this district was that because they didn't have the number of students, of Black students in those communities, they were not being served to the extent that our Black students in Eugene proper were being served. So we have to make some systemic changes and shift to be able to make sure that we ensure that we provided the same amount of support that the students in those areas as the students in the metro area. So I hear you, George, and I think that talking about this topic, I'm intrigued about the topic about teacher factor, because that is huge too, because depending on the amount of funding that you have in that district, so it goes the ability for you to provide instruction to the children in those areas. So I think it's valid.
Well, thank you, everybody, for those comments and really specific real world examples, right? Yeah, really fascinating stuff. As far as next steps, so I told you, for the next meeting likely will not be in February because of this legislative session going on, and many of you are very involved in the legislative session. So we'll do the same kind of doodle poll kind of idea. I also had on the list to update you. It's going to be very brief on the researcher RFP. It's still in process to go out and everything. We're feeling better about our procurement efforts though lately, because the legislature is in the process of giving us additional procurement staff. So feeling better about that from when I talked to you a few months ago. So that's my brief update on that. Thank you for your rich conversations today and thoughts and ideas, and special thank you from multiple groups to Mariana and Mike for their presentation. I heard that from multiple groups coming in, and everybody have a good night. Thanks.